Good morning. My name is Myron Frans. I'm Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. I want to thank you for joining us today. Commissioner Massman and I want to take some time today to provide some context and examples of the critical infrastructure needs that were included in the Governor's Public Works proposal. I will start by providing a general short overview of the proposal, and then Commissioner Massman will provide more context and examples. We've also provided you with a handout that offers photos and examples from around the state. These examples show that we are not simply talking about cosmetic changes. We have real, serious infrastructure needs throughout Minnesota. On January 16th, Governor Dayton released his 2018 Public Works proposal. The governor recommended urgently needed investments to, number one, build world-class colleges and universities for Minnesotans. Number two, improve and maintain state buildings and other assets around the state. Number three, increase affordable housing around the state. Number four, deliver clean, reliable, affordable drinking water for Minnesotans. And five, address other critical infrastructure needs across the state. These infrastructure needs will only grow more costly if we wait to fix them in the future. Some of people have called Governor Dayton's proposal a meat and potatoes bill. But as I look at it, it really is making sure that we're making the smart choice to repair a roof before it fails and thereby creating more costly repairs. This is a no-frills bill that invests in the state's current assets, ensuring that state workplaces are safe for employees, public buildings, bridges, and parks are functional and open for business, and most importantly, it ensures Minnesotans continue to receive the services that they need and experience a high quality of life that we know and come to expect in Minnesota. Approximately 50% of the state's higher education buildings are currently in a fair or worse condition. And Commissioner Massman will talk more about this in terms of the state assets, but it costs on average 70% more to repair a structure in poor condition than maintaining a building in fair condition. The governor's proposal includes projects distributed across the state. The bill balances the needs of the entire state, with 67% of the projects having statewide impacts, 11% of the projects in greater Minnesota, and 22% in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. The governor's proposal is designed to make state resources go further by leveraging more than $570 million in private, local, and federal investment in Minnesota infrastructure. Our recent debt capacity forecast shows that we have a $3.5 billion available bonding capacity. The governor's proposal remains well within that bonding capacity. But don't take my word for it. If you look at what Minnesota's credit agencies have said, credit rating agencies, they have all said, Fitch, Standard & Poor's, and Moody's, that their decision in part on our credit rating is based on the fact that the state maintains a moderate debt burden and adherence to well-established debt management guidelines. We expect interest rates to remain moderate and low, and with our credit ratings, now is the time to borrow money and make those investments. The alternative is to continue kicking the can down the road, ignoring the routine maintenance our aging state assets so desperately need, and which will only get more expensive if we wait to repair them. This is not only a proposal we can afford, it is a proposal that we really must do now. I'll now turn it over to Commissioner Massman.
Careful for your water. Oops.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Myron, and good morning, everyone. Let me start with a little prop here. This little doohickey has a name. It's a water pipe cap, maybe about a ½ an inch, let's just say. The failure of one of these probably costs less than $1 to buy, plus some labor to install. The failure of one of these cost thousands of dollars of damage, and had it been on a weekend, it potentially could have been hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage in the Centennial Office building not too far back. But also let me, as I get started here, observe that I think it's particularly appropriate that we be here today in the restored state capitol to be talking about Governor Dayton's $1.5 billion of recommendations for repairing and preserving state assets. The state capitol, as you all know, is likely the most recognizable of assets in the state that are publicly owned. It can be talked about in a lot of different ways, but one way that this restoration project can be known for is it's the single largest asset preservation project that we've done in state history. But there are many, many more projects and state buildings all across the state that need the same amount of work. As Myron highlighted, Governor Dayton recommends urgently needed capital investments to higher education facilities, for affordable housing, for public water infrastructure, and $458 million to restore and repair and maintain buildings and facilities that we already have. I want to focus on that $458 million and provide you with some background on the magnitude and the significance of the problem and why Governor Dayton's bonding recommendations are so urgently needed. The Department of Administration operates the Enterprise Real Property Program, and a key function of that is to work with state agencies to assess and track the state's buildings and the condition of those buildings using objective apples-to-apples criteria. What we know is that the state agencies operate about 6,200 buildings statewide on behalf of taxpayers that are worth about a little over $10 billion. Those buildings are spread across 86 of Minnesota's 87 counties, with about half of that value in the metro area and about half in greater Minnesota. Let me level set a little bit about the condition of those buildings. Common rule of thumb for buildings is that the useful life of major building systems is about 40 years. Well, within the next decade, half or more of all Minnesota state buildings will be 50 years or older. Let me say that another way. Within the next 10 years, half of our buildings will be at or beyond their useful life if we don't follow up with ongoing maintenance. Today, even as we talk here today, there's over $500 million worth of repairs that are needed just to buildings and building systems that are already rated today in poor or critical condition. That means, for example, we have a building near Duluth that's part of the public safety system that was built in 1937, still has the original 1937 windows and brickwork and tuck pointing, 80 years of Minnesota winters of snow and ice and rain and hail. We now have water coming into that building, obviously without the repairs that have been needed, costing more and causing extensive damage to that building and a higher cost of repairing it. So we are in a position where we are really struggling to catch up when we need to be keeping up and preventing damage from happening to buildings in the first place. It's a simple reality that the longer you delay projects, the more costly they get, and the worse the problem gets. It costs, as Myron referred to, another way to think about it is it costs about 4 times more to transition a building back from a poor condition to a good condition, or about 12 times more to return a building to excellent condition from a crisis state. So let me give another couple of examples. Out in Windham, the DNR has an office where delays due to inadequate funding have increased the cost of repairs to that building by about 30%. And many of you, of course, will recall that back in 2016, the state had to pay $1.6 million just to do repairs caused by one leaky pipe on a weekend in the state office building across the street. So it's just simply sound fiscal management to take care of these maintenance needs before they become worse. We all know that asset preservation projects and funding requests don't drum up the kind of excitement as do shiny new construction buildings, but these are, as it has been referred to, I think, meat and potatoes projects that are essential to maintaining safe and well-functioning public infrastructure across the state. And I just want to make the point that they are local projects. These buildings are located all across the state, and they would result in construction work and economic opportunity for families and communities from the headwaters of the Mississippi to Laverne, and from Thief River Falls to Albert Lee. They're also not simply office buildings where state employees go to work. These projects would happen at libraries and laboratories, parks and public health facilities, historic sites and hiking trails, campsites and correctional facilities. From armories to the zoo, these are buildings that add to Minnesotans' quality of life. These projects are also important from a safety perspective. Just this last year in 2017, at a state-owned facility out near Faribault, there was some dilapidated ductwork that unexpectedly gave way and collapsed into a work area. Thankfully, no one was injured as a result of that incident. In Shakopee, we have facilities that have a fire alarm system that is so outdated that the manufacturer of that fire alarm system refuses to work on it anymore. And so we need to scour the country to find replacement parts to prop that system up and find third-party vendors who are willing to work on it. As you'll see from the photo behind me out at the Fort Snelling Visitors Center, staff of the state archaeologists have been for well over 2 years working with a yellow tarp above their head. Now, if you can see from the photo, it's a nice yellow tarp, and it certainly might add to the character of the room, but that's not the way the building is supposed to work. That tarp is there to catch periodic water leaks and redirect through a tube in the center of the tarp down to the drain. So clearly, that's a project that we need to work on. As has been referred to, we have a handout for you of some visual stories that provide examples for you to look at, but these examples are not by any means an exhaustive list of the needed repairs. And these repairs also are needed because these projects directly impact Minnesotans and their quality of life. Two final examples. At Old Mill State Park near Thief River Falls, there's a suspension bridge that has had to be closed due to deteriorating condition. And this is a bridge that's been used by generations of campers to access the park, and obviously the loss of that bridge greatly diminishes the ability of Minnesotans to enjoy that park. And I think many of you have heard before, there's also Blue Mound State Park near Laverne, where groundwater contamination has led to no potable water out there. That means no drinking water, no showers, no flush toilets for people who visit that park facility. So obviously a project that is in desperate need of funding to connect that park to the rural water supply so that that facility can be returned to being part of the economic vibrancy of the community there. I'll just close with commenting also that funding for this kind of infrastructure work is not part of agency operating budgets. Bond-supported capital improvement funds like the $1.5 billion that Governor Dayton has recommended, including the $450 million for state buildings, must be appropriated for this work to get done. It's why bonding bills exist. So in the end of the day, not every project obviously can be as exciting or popular as the state capitol, but these projects all serve the public, and they're greatly needed and located all across the state. And with that, Myron and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Your dew thingy there.
Doohickey, a water pipe cap.
Tell us more about what that came from and what happened and how much damage that caused.
This is part of the, I could get you an exact number. This particular one was caught, so before the leaking got really bad. Obviously it had failed, but the leaking was caught before it got bad. What it is basically part of the HVAC system, and it caps off the water cooling lines within the building, obviously to keep water from running into the building and keeping it in the pipes.
You mentioned that these are not part of the operating budgets. I gotta believe a lot of viewers, readers, listeners will be asking, why not? Why isn't routine maintenance part of the agency's typical budgets year after year after year?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to remember that agency operating budgets include funding for things like waxing the floor, painting, fixing door hinges, keeping buildings safe, but they don't include funding for capital investments like replacing a roof every 20 or 25 years, or tuck pointing, or replacing windows after they've come to the end of their useful life. So this is the kind of work that's funded and needs to be funded by a capital investment bill.
The House and Senate members of the Capital Investment Committee have been touring the state. Have they been to any of these locations that you've got on your list?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if you do, Myron.
They've been to a lot of them. One of the things that the list of projects that they review, and we also go to all the local projects as best we can, most of the time our list of visits are pretty similar, but I don't have the specific list of whether they attended these, but I'd be surprised if they didn't. Most of the time they get to these kind of projects, especially in greater Minnesota.
But imagine some fiscal conservatives who are skeptical of taking on more debt to improve these things would say, look, you're putting us in a situation where you're saying we need to fix all these buildings, but the problem is we have so many buildings and state government is too big. And what we really need to do is lean up and figure out which of these we need to cut off. Have you guys explored, have the agencies explored those possibilities of saying, you know, maybe we abandon this one building and consolidate?
One of the issues, this is a fiscally conservative budget proposal, frankly, because to conserve the assets that you do have is a fiscally conservative measure. The question about what assets we should keep over the long run is something that we deal with all the time. Both the University of Minnesota, Minnesota State, and Commissioner Massman and his team continue to review the status. And there are occasions when a particular building has reached a state that it's not worth saving. But generally, what we are experiencing is an increased demand for services and an increased delivery of services around the state. So we haven't seen a list of proposals to eliminate any buildings from anybody. What we're seeing is a demand for more. And if you're going to have these buildings out there, we believe that you're really committed to maintaining them in a state that's fair, safe, dry, and functional.
You know, and the one thing I would just add to Myron's comment is there is an established process in place in statute, and we actually do, as a state, dispose of buildings when they no longer have a public purpose. And we, in fact, at the Department of Administration have just sold 2 buildings in the past year on behalf of agencies. So that does happen.
You mentioned the debt capacity. Can you talk about the state debt and where we're at and what this proposal will do to it?
Yeah, we maintain 3 different guidelines for debt capacity, and they're all, right now, we're all underneath all of the caps. And so part of that is designed to see what is the debt that the state has in relation to the total personal income in the state of Minnesota, which is reaching somewhere around $300 billion a year. And the different debt capacity guidelines say that we shouldn't have any more debt outstanding than 3.5% of that particular number, and we're under 3% at this point. So in all the 3 different measures of debt capacity, we just released a report on this in December after the February forecast. We provide an actual computation, and in that computation, we also show what is the maximum debt that we could issue in 2018 and still remain within those guidelines. And that's where you've heard us say that we could issue $3.5 billion in bonding debt this year and still be within all of those guidelines going forward, assuming $1 billion every biennium or so going forward. So that's how we try to measure that.
Okay, so again, it's based on a $300 billion spending capacity. 3.5% is the debt ceiling.
The credit rating agencies like to try to compare apples to apples from one state to another, so they've come up with this, and that's why we try to follow what the credit agencies use in terms of our capacity. They try to measure what's your ability to pay, and that's based upon what is a total personal income in a state, because that really gives you an indication of how much income and wealth there is in a state, and it's approaching $300 billion on an annual basis in Minnesota. That's the upper limit, and we take a percentage of that in terms of what can we afford in a debt, and it's under 3.5% per year.
If Minnesota does tax conformity with the federal tax bill, how would this bonding proposal impact that?
With the bonding proposal, we have assumed in the forecast an $800 million proposal. So one of the things that we try to do every budget that we prepare is assume, based on past practices, how much bonding are we going to do, and assume that going forward, so the forecast takes care of that amount. So we've assumed an $800 million bonding bill in 2018 based on past bonding levels. So if we go to a $1.5 billion bonding bill, that would cost an additional $12 million in debt for 2019 because it's only 1 year of the biennium. It costs another $89 million in 20 and 21. So those amounts are separate from the income that or adjustments we're going to have to do with the federal tax bill. One of the things that we will be doing in the forecast that we release on February 28th is to analyze the projection for debt, and also we'll try to analyze what is the current effect of the federal tax bill on the state of Minnesota's current tax system. Because one of the things we do when we forecast is we base our forecast on current law. So the current law is the new federal tax bill and the old Minnesota or the current Minnesota tax bill. And there are some differences, as you know, in that. And so one of the challenges we're going to have in February is to try to figure out what are some of those differences, realizing it's highly likely that the legislature and the governor will make some changes in this session to both true up the new federal tax code with the current Minnesota tax code, and then make policy choices about where to conform and where not to conform. So that's an extremely complicated part of this process. But the debt capacity is especially for 18-19, is only $12 million for the additional $1.5 billion bonding capacity. So it doesn't have a huge effect on this current budget.
Last question?
What sort of feedback have you gotten from Republicans, especially the leadership, on these ideas?
One of the constant feedback issues that we get is that when they go around the state and they tour these projects and they see how important it is to everybody every project they go to, how much it means to them, how important it is for whether it's a school, University of Minnesota or Minnesota State University or a DNR building. They really understand the need for that, and they have been concerned about going above the $800 million or the $1 billion limit. And one of the things that I've tried to talk to them about on a regular basis is the $1 billion limit sort of came into play back in 1997 when Governor Carlson was governor. That was the first time we had a $1 billion bonding bill. Well, under today's, using inflation, that would be a $1.5 billion bonding bill today. So I'm trying to do my best to convince them that A, we can afford it, it's within our debt guidelines. The rating agencies will view this as not an aberration if we have a $1.5 billion bonding bill, and that we just need to take a lot of these projects off the table once and for all. But to be honest, they're concerned about the number, and that's something we're going to have to deal with is, can we come up with an agreement to do something more than a $1 billion bonding bill this session? And I hope we do, because these projects are so critical. And the University of Minnesota, Minnesota State have made the same case for their I think it's like over $500 million for higher education. So there's a lot on the table now. If we could take this batch of projects and get them finished, because as you know, we get $3.5 billion in requests every year, every time we have a bonding bill. That's a lot of legitimate projects out there that need to be done. And so if we could take a big number of those off the table this year, it would be great progress.
If I may ask a quick follow-up question, is that $800 limit that you're kind of planning on, is that a financial limit, or is that a cultural and philosophical limit?
Well, the $800 million forecast assumption is simply based on past practice. We average what's been done over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's usually 800 million and 220 million in an off year. So it's been about $1.020 billion is what we've averaged. So it simply reflects an agreement that we will forecast or budget for what we've done in the past. That's all that means. And so it may mean more to other people. That's all it means to me. And so what we're saying is, given that we have the 800 million in the forecast, we only need to think about the amount of money it would take to add to that with the $1.5 billion limit. I think the $1 billion limit that the legislature has talked about is more the philosophical or concern that they have, and we just hope we can change their mind on that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all very
Thank you.
much.